Welcome to a special episode of the Pursuit Podcast. If you're coming here from Hanselminutes, you already know that this is part of a two-part special done with Scott Hanselman. If you're just tuning in for the first time and you want to hear the first part of this podcast, go to hanselman.com. Today, Scott Hanselman and I are going to be looking at the topic of bad advice people have gotten in technology. Let's dive in. I'm here today with
Scott Hanselman.
Scott, what do you do?
I work on open source at Microsoft. I work on opensource.net and ASP.NET, which is our web framework.
Very, very cool. And we're doing a special joint split podcast, where yesterday I came and appeared on your podcast, and today you're over here. Mm-hmm. And on both days, both half hours, we're talking about the worst advice people have gotten in technology.
Yes, and there was a lot of lousy advice. And of course, you'll never run out of lousy advice. We could make a whole podcast just about all the lousy advice and go on for hundreds of episodes.
Could you, off the top of your head, think about some of the worst advice you've ever gotten?
Oh, goodness. Don't say anything, just work hard and they'll eventually notice you and then give you a promotion.
Oh, that's terrible advice.
Yeah, I don't know why. There's a lot of people being told just toil in obscurity and eventually people will notice you. I do believe very much that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. I do also realize that that's dependent on where you're coming from. Some people, to speak up is to give visibility to them, and they might feel like asking for a raise would get them fired just simply by asking. And other people might not have that problem.
Yeah, like knowing when and how to advocate for yourself, when and how to be visible. It's really hard. You can't always get good advice from someone who's not you.
Yeah, it's tough. I can give you a really good example, actually, if you don't mind.
Please.
I'm a fairly competent, straight white guy, and I'm able to go and say, hey, I really feel like I deserve a raise, and half the time I'll be successful. But my wife, who is a Black African woman who believes that she should work really hard and toil, and hopefully people will notice her, spent a number of years making $10,000 less than she should have. And I kept encouraging her to go and ask for that raise, and it just doesn't quite work that way for her. So what she ended up doing was building an entire report about how awesome she was and presenting that. Here are the actual measurable reasons that you should give me a raise, and was successful after she had evidence, if that makes sense.
No, this is something that's really, really familiar. There's a book that's out called What Works? Gender Equality by Design, written by Iris Buchnet, I think. And she talks very explicitly, backed up by a lot of numbers, about what you can expect asking for a raise as somebody who's well represented versus being a woman of color. And a lot of her research shows that just asking doesn't really pan out if you're not as well represented as you could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I did my best to give her the advice, but I gave it to her with the understanding that putting my exact words in her mouth might land differently. So we adjusted the advice based on the industry she was in and the relationship she had with her boss.
Oh, that's really helpful. I think my husband tried a couple times to be like, oh, what you need to do is you just need to go in there and you need to tell them. And eventually we came to a similar understanding.
Yeah. I'm saying go in there and be loud and pushy doesn't always work for everyone.
So we went ahead and asked on Twitter for people to share their worst advice possible. And I figured we'd dive right in. So the first bit of bad advice that we're going to share with you, dear listener, comes from Ola. Ola works up at Mozilla, and she got, she got this advice.
The worst career advice I ever got was to leave open source and actually get a real job.
So yeah, getting a quote-unquote real job, right?
Yeah, that's tough. That implies that good work that isn't paid work isn't work. I think open source is work and volunteerism is work, and that's horrible advice.
And I think seeing as Ola wound up at Mozilla doing fancy open source stuff all the time, super off base.
Yeah, absolutely off base. I'm glad that she landed on her feet because it sounds like she ignored that advice.
One of the most glorious things about Ola is she doesn't suffer fools, I think. So I think if somebody came out to be like, hey, please have my garbage advice about open source, I'd be really surprised if she took something like that on board.
Absolutely.
I think it does raise an interesting point, though. It can be difficult to get work that's unpaid or work that's in a less prominently paid area recognized as work?
Well, I mean, if it has a URL, if you can point to the work, then doesn't that make it work? Like, I realize that if it has a URL, that's maybe a low bar, but I've always felt like if it either has a URL or it's something you could show them, like, I helped ship that, or you can visit this website, or you can download that. That seems pretty real. Even if it's your local community website for your church or your club, that is something that has a URL you could point to and say, I did that work.
Yeah. So being able to say, look, this is real, this exists on the internet, therefore it is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That is overly simplistic because I realize not everything is outside, but for everything outside, I've done work for my kids' charter school. That's work. It can be pointed to.
I actually really like this. So this feels very gently philosophical. If it exists on the web, it exists. If it exists, it's work.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, I wonder whether or not the advice that she got is from somebody maybe less familiar with or less connected to open source.
I think that is a very good point. I can't imagine someone in the open source community pointing someone away from the open source community unless they had a really lousy experience that had affected their career.
Yeah, like listening to this, I wonder, I'd be like, do you just think it's all free and there's no money? Do you not understand that there's sort of billions and billions of dollars connected to the open source ecosystem?
So someone brought up an interesting point, though, that it is very easy for someone to say, go do some open source, like we all are blessed with copious spare time. When I see that someone has the ability, the time, the energy, the privilege, the whatever to do open source, I'm always impressed. I can't think of any way to be not impressed with a person that has that amount of passion or energy. Given that not everyone can or has, I think it's fantastic.
Like, I don't have as many out-of-work responsibilities as many people out there, or maybe as many as you, or you, dear listener. But by the time I get done with a day, the idea of looking at a screen for anything more complicated than Civ 6 is a little bit beyond me.
Yeah, and I had a lot more energy to do open source at a different time, and I think that there was some great advice from Sarah May on MEI on Twitter, where she said, "Hey, sometimes you've got the energy and the enthusiasm and the excitement, and sometimes you don't, and that's okay."
Yeah, and I think that's okay is a really, really great and really healthy way to put it. Like, well, if you want to do this, it's super cool and it is doing great stuff. But if you don't, it's cool. Live your life and be a human.
Yeah, and I would like to see a way to hire people with understanding that they have full lives that are not entirely revolving around technology. I think I would be just as excited to hire someone who worked in open source at night that I would be to hire someone who did, I don't know, CrossFit or taught refugees to read. I mean, passion and work that is not necessarily technology is still passion.
And I think that gets really difficult as well, because a lot of times I guess the whole theme of this episode is bad advice. A lot of times we give people looking for work or in the industry the advice that, oh, don't worry about it. We're all hiring on passion. We're all hiring for potential. And while that would be great and that's the way things should be, I'm not really sure that's where the industry is yet.
No, I definitely don't think it is. But hopefully giving people some visibility into this kind of thing with podcasts like this will bring them around slowly.
We'll shout at managers one at a time until we make this happen.
Indeed.
So that's a really interesting point. A lot of the clips we've been listening to are individual people being given advice. And a lot of times it sounds very much like advice from managers or advice from sort of someone in charge.
Interesting.
What kind of advice do you think that you'd want more managers to have or more founders? What would you like to tell the boss?
Well, see, you lost me when you said founders, because I have a little bit of an issue with that term, right? A founder
please.
A founder to me is just someone who got there first. Maybe they sacrificed or they mortgaged their house. I mean, I realize that there's a lot in that word founders, but I think the way to look at it is, like you said, the person in power, I think, tends to minimize the amount of work required to get there. Because once you've climbed up that mountain, however you did, whether it be luck or hard work or founders or Bitcoin, at some point you turn around and then you say, come on, jump up. It's fine, and you make people.
I did it.
I did it. Why is it such a problem? Right. And I think that when we give advice, we should be more empathetic. We should let people know that we understand how complicated it is and that you're not trying to hire someone who is also a founder or try to hire someone who is also where you're at. You're hiring people a couple steps behind you and then hopefully lifting them up to where you are.
That's a really compelling point. So I've got one more clip, and this is advice explicitly coming from a manager. Let's see what Rich's manager had to say to him over what I hope was a nice lunch.
I had a meeting in a hotel restaurant with the chief officer of the multinational I worked for. He'd asked if we had any product ideas, even if they were unrelated to the business of the company. When I dared to ask how we could keep ownership of our ideas, he started shouting, saying that I should be grateful for the salary and environment he provided me with, which was apparently responsible for any ideas I had. I don't work there anymore.
So, yikes. Here, it kind of sounds like the advice is give us everything you could possibly think of and be grateful for the opportunity?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I could understand where a boss might say, hey, you've got some good ideas and you're well thought of in the company. Do you have any ideas on what we can do to improve the way we do business? That seems like a valid thing and a good reason. But the idea of give me business ideas and I will take them and run with them and you should be happy that I even let you hang out with us seems exploitative.
And explicitly saying, oh, don't worry whether or not they're related to our work. Just give me all your ideas. Like, I don't know what kind of lunch it is, but I'd hope it was a quite nice lunch to be that bold.
Yeah, it seems also simplistic, and I would probably run away from that company. That seems like might be a little bit of a concern that company's not healthy.
Well, they're either having a difficult time understanding their scope or they're desperate.
Yeah, I think desperate is a fair statement, and that's even more concerning. Not that they're desperate to ask for your advice, but I just feel like they're grasping at straws.
Yeah, a lot of this bad advice sounds really weird, being to what I hope is rational adults talking to each other sort of in the light of day and looking at it.
Mm-hmm. When someone asks for your advice like that or your ideas, there's also, I think, sometimes the concern over kind of intellectual property. People sometimes have things that they're doing on the side, moonlighting that they may or may not be doing under the moonlighting rules of their company, and even open source work. So do you think that people might need to keep things separate sometimes?
So I've seen a lot of times where people accidentally ran afoul of rules or they didn't read their contracts well enough. I think a lot of times there is, like Rich had, this expectation from employers this expectation from bad employers that when they pay you, they own you. All your ideas, that all your work becomes theirs. So being really assertive around looking at your contract, making sure you're not bringing any of your side projects into work or onto work machines can be a really valuable way to sort of protect yourself.
How separate should you keep things? I tend to give the advice that if you are doing a side thing or some open source or some separate thing, if you want to keep it separate, you should keep it off of your company's internet. You should keep it off your company's laptops.
Yes. I'd say at least that. Having a serious think about what you share with your company as well. By the way, I'm working on this. By the way, I had this great idea. It can be a really cool thing to talk about with your friends, but I might not mention to my manager, oh, by the way, I'm working on this side project in this space. Is it their business?
I think that it will be their business when that thing appears, when that thing comes out of nowhere. And that's all the more reason that you protect yourself by making sure that it was not done at night in their offices, on their machine, on their internet, because then you're mixing your worlds too much.
Just saying that, I bet one or two listeners who mine Bitcoin at work suddenly feel gently terrified. You should probably feel gently terrified if you're mining Bitcoin at work.
Yeah, I would definitely be concerned about the mining Bitcoin thing. I'm thinking more about be straightforward and be honest about what you're working on. And like you said, read your paperwork. When I got to work at Microsoft the first time, I thought maybe I'd have to get rid of my blog and get rid of my podcast, but I was able to read the paperwork and figured out that this can be done as moonlighting. They call it formal moonlighting, which is basically saying as long as your manager knows what you're doing and it's not what you do in your day job, right? You're not doing stuff at night that is also stuff that you're being paid for. Everyone's got a little side gig, but hiding that side gig entirely, I would not recommend that.
Okay, so maybe we politely disagree. I think that if it's something that doesn't overlap with your duties, if it doesn't compete directly with your business, I'd also probably encourage people to look out for things like comms or public perception policies, whether or not you're, I don't know, off the top of my head, doing a podcast. And work might take umbrage for that.
Well, that's a tough one. So what if we say something unflattering to work and then you start getting into, well, we don't want you speaking about your job or speaking on behalf of the company?
So for me personally, I try and keep the stuff I do and my job very, very separate. I don't think I've ever mentioned where I work on the podcast. But at the same time, I'm not going to say anything unkind or unflattering about my work. In large part because I legitimately love them and they're fantastic.
Sure.
But also because it seems like a very silly thing to do, sort of publicly disparage a company that you work for. It's not great for your continued employment.
Indeed. Still, these things happen. I think the point is, I think we do agree, keep things separate. Then the only thing that you and I disagree on is whether or not you give your job a heads up about the things that you do in your spare time.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the amount of trust you have with your company and the experiences you've had with them to date. I think it might be a bigger question of how much to trust a company. I think as well, folks based in the US may have fewer job protections than folks I generally tap to based here in Europe. So a lot of my advice, they're like, no, trust them, go. The stuff I'd really want to say, like, believe in the goodness of your fellow humans, is possibly a lot riskier for folks that have fewer job protections.
Interesting. So that, I think, is really interesting. The difference between how much you should trust the company based on the country that's in and probably also the size of the company.
Well, because almost all U.S. states, you can get fired just for funsies.
Well, yeah, they call it at-will employment, which is that, we're choosing not to work with you anymore, period. And that's the case in most states, at least in the states that I've been in.
Yeah, when I was based in the States, that was a similar thing. They can't explicitly fire you for being part of a protected class, but they can fire you for not liking your hat.
Right. And there are other people who also might give the advice, don't trust HR, while someone else might say, oh yeah, HR works for you, when maybe, in fact, HR works for the company.
I was just talking to somebody about this recently. There's often the desire for people on a team you want to have HR take up the duties or take up the role that maybe things like unions had 10 or 20 years ago. You want them to sort of advocate for you and have your back. I'm not really going to weigh in on whether or not you should trust HR. I think it depends on where you are. It depends on the general tone of the company.
And it's a very good point. There are HR people that I've worked with at large companies where I felt an emotional connection with the people, and I felt like they were, in fact, my advocate. And then there were other ones that I felt like they were a spy for the company.
That sounds very exciting, but not positive.
Less so when you're in the middle of it. But indeed, I think that what we're coming to, though, is that advice is so relative. It's relative to the person. It's relative to the location, which gets to your point where you had said, how many people do you ask for advice when it comes time to go looking?
So if it's something very, very big and very serious, I'll generally try and get 2 or 3 different people. And I'll try and ask folks who are as similar to my background as possible, which gets a little bit difficult.
Well, it gets difficult because of there's age, there's gender, there's where you are in your career, but there's also, like you said, your physical location, expats, and people with your background.
Yeah, I think if I was called upon to get a perfect copy, a 30 mumble-year-old American based in the UK with a background in education, now working in, that'd be a bit much.
Yeah, it would. That's a good point. And the farther that we get down our path, the farther away our paths diverge from other people. So how do you pick your board of directors, your advisory board?
Oh, so I do try and get at least one person who's somewhat similar to me and can speak to my experience. But I'll usually try and get some folks who are different as well. So one person I almost always ask, I'm not sure if you're allowed to have a work wife who doesn't work with you, but a dear friend of mine, Florence, is absolutely brilliant. So patient, so smart. And she's one of these people who's brilliant, but not a jerk about it. She's smarter than you, but she doesn't make you feel bad. She's one of my first stops for advice.
Those are always the best kind of people. I think also people that are both emotionally invested in your success, but not so emotionally invested in their success that they won't give you hard advice.
That's a really interesting one.
Yeah.
So folks who love you enough to invest, but don't love you so much that it's coloring their advice one way or another.
Yeah. So they have their own thing. They're not your roommate or your spouse or your partner. Your success or failure doesn't mean that the rent that they depend on doesn't get paid. Someone who is on a parallel track, but even maybe somewhere else in another city, and they'll be bummed if it doesn't work out for you. But at the same time, they want to see you shine, and your success does not hold them back.
So one thing as well that I find really useful when looking for folks to get advice from is looking for somebody just a little bit above you on the path you're interested in.
Yes. I actually like to say someone who's diagonal.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, up and to the side. Maybe they are, who you want to be in another industry a year or two ahead.
Oh, and another industry is a very good idea. Oh, I didn't expect to get so much good advice in a meta conversation about advice on advice. That's probably too many advices.
It's Inception.
We'll put a tiny podcast inside this podcast. It'll podcasts all the way down. Or advice.
That would be cool. Mm-hmm.
So I think one thing I'd be really interested in exploring a bit more is we've talked a little bit about good and bad advice. We've talked about people to get advice from, sourcing your own board of directors, as you call it. How do you know when to politely reject advice? How do you evaluate something and then just internally throw it in the bin?
Yeah, I think that you nailed it when you said internally. I don't think you have to reject advice formally to their face. You don't have to say, that's crappy advice, I'm not going to do it. I think you just say...
I've done that once or twice, and it's really satisfying.
It may be satisfying.
Don't do it often.
Yeah, I'm not one for confrontation. I would argue that you're basically collecting votes and opinions, and you put it all in a pile, and you weigh it like pros and cons, right? Getting advice is collecting the pros and cons from other people. It's just sourcing an extra pair of eyeballs.
So that's really interesting, looking at not as the explicit guidance the people giving it to you might think it is, but sort of as an extra data point.
Yeah, I think if you're trying to say, I'm overwhelmed, tell me what to do, then that's a problem. But if you're basically saying, I need a fresh perspective, I am explicitly going to you because I am overwhelmed and I think I know I am too close to this thing.
So that's a really interesting point as well, like explicitly going to someone for advice. We've listened to different points of bad advice and chatted a bit about, do you think a lot of this bad advice is solicited or is it just weirdos?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I feel like I might be equivocating, but I think it's probably 50-50, right?
Okay.
I've known that I've gone to my parents and asked for advice and gotten bad advice and then said to myself, why did I put myself through that? But then at the other time, it seems like there is a proliferation of bad advice that is unsolicited. People giving you advice for no reason, and I didn't ask you. And those are the tough ones where you just have to say, thank you, I'm good.
So with advice, I often think about it the same as getting physical things in the mail. If it's something that someone sent me and I didn't ask for, it's probably something I don't want. It's probably another takeaway menu or a flyer. Yeah.
Exactly.
If it's being given away free, if it's given to me for free without my asking, I'm not going to ascribe a lot of value.
Yes.
But if I've got to order it or if I've got to solicit it, it might actually turn out to be something I want.
I've had friends say, don't come for me if I didn't send for you.
Oh, that's very royal. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the point here is that the people need to take control of their advice. Advice should be a pull operation, not a push operation. I don't want people who are going to push or impose their advice upon me, but I do want a pool of like-minded and sometimes not like-minded people from which I can pull their advice when I need it.
That's fantastic. If we were going to get extremely meta, right before we go ahead and say goodbye and have to break off this wonderful conversation, what kind of advice would you want to give people giving advice?
What kind of advice would I want to give? And this to the advisor or the people asking for advice? I would say the people...
to the advisors. So folks who love to give advice, what would you tell them?
Okay, so people who love to give advice, I would remind them that their success or failure does not depend on whether or not someone chooses or chooses not to take their advice. Your self-worth should not be wrapped up in whether or not you're a super advisor. Give the advice, give it freely, but you have to give the advice with no strings attached. Just let it go. It's advice.
That's really, really interesting. So don't expect your advice to be taken on board necessarily, and don't expect some sort of grand thank you or a bundle of flowers, but just expect that you've given the advice and it exists now in the world.
Exactly, because you gave the advice, but they took the action, so they get to reap the rewards.
So just to end on a really positive note, we've heard some terrible advice, both the bad advice you've gotten, the bad advice we've heard today on these clips, and the advice we heard yesterday. And to remind you all, it's at Hanselminutes.com if you want to go back and get it. What's the best advice you can remember getting?
Ooh, you're putting me on the spot. The best advice?
Some of the best advice.
I'm literally going all the way back to like 5th grade. It was when I was in 5th grade, I was loaned a computer. We couldn't afford a computer, so I was loaned one. And I only had it for some hours on the weekend. And the teacher that loaned it to me told me to make every hour count. And I would say that advice is something that I think about even now.
That's really fantastic. For me, my favorite advice, the best, is advice I get from my husband pretty frequently. So for those of you listening and for you listening, you may have caught that I like to talk. So I do like to go to my husband, who's recently gotten into technology himself, and ask him for advice. And he's sort of the best rubber duck in the world. He'll listen. He'll say, okay, what are your options? And he'll listen. It's like, what are the potential problems? And he'll listen. He's like, well, can you do it? I was like, yeah, I can probably do it. He's like, okay, well, go away and do it. Like, come back when there's a real problem. And that kind of dismissive, just go do the thing, is weirdly the best advice I could get.
If it works, it works.
Lovingly dismissive.
Indeed. Yes, with the best intentions.
Thank you so much for making time and joining us.
Oh, absolutely my pleasure.